Hello and welcome back to The Fall of the Roman Empire. It's Nick Holmes and this is episode 105 called Heraclius Triumphant. In the last episode we heard how Heraclius's fortunes had been transformed in 626. The Avars had been slaughtered before the walls of Constantinople. He destroyed yet another Persian army in Anatolia, forcing the Persian general Shahrbaraz to retreat east, and his new allies the Turks had invaded Persia through the Caucasus, opening up a second front for the Persians. And the outlook for 627 was just as promising. In the winter of 626, the Turks withdrew north of the Caucasus, laden with Persian booty, prisoners, livestock, and gold and silver vessels. So successful was their raid, the Yabgu Khagan, the Turkish lord of the western half of the Turkish Confederation, decided to do the same the next year, although this time with even greater force. So he mobilised all the peoples under Turkish control, similar to the way in which the Avar Khagan had mobilised the Slavs for his abortive attack on Constantinople, as we discussed in the last episode. Meanwhile, Heraclius rested his victorious army over the winter and made one of his infrequent visits to the capital towards the end of the year. He missed a grand celebration of the Roman victory over the Avars held in the city on the 8th of September, but his appearance in the capital later in the year must have boosted the inhabitants' morale. His plan for 627 was to meet up with the Turkish Khagan at Tiflis, a Persian stronghold guarding the Caucasus midpoint between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. Our sources say he travelled from Constantinople in the spring of 627 to Trebizond, a major port 2/3 of the way along Anatolia's northern shore with the Black Sea. His army set off from Caesarea in Anatolia to meet him there. Meanwhile, Khosroes was on the defensive, no longer even thinking of attacking Constantinople. He was instead concentrating on defending the Caucasus from another Turkish attack and raising another army in Iran, this time under the command of a new general called Razad. The problem for Khosroes was that Shahrbaraz's army, which was by far the best unit remaining to the Sasanians, was standing idle in northern Syria, waiting to block any Roman attempt to recover the Levant and Egypt. But that wasn't where Heraclius planned to strike. When Khosroes learnt of his intention to rendezvous with the Turks in Tiflis, he sent substantial reinforcements there. The Turkish assault began in around May 627. Our sources delight in telling of the ferocity of their attack. They tell us so intense was their arrow fire and so large their numbers that the first fortified town of Chor was overwhelmed and the Persian garrison and the town's inhabitants slaughtered to a man. The next town was Partor, where the terrified inhabitants initially resisted and then, at the last moment, panicked, opened the gates and fled into the countryside, leaving the town deserted. The Turks surged on until they reached Tiflis, where Heraclius's army joined them. Outside the walls of Tiflis, Heraclius and the Yabgu Khagan stage-managed a display of Roman-Turkish amity. Our Roman sources describe the Yabgu Khagan prostrating himself before Heraclius, which was almost certainly untrue in my view. What's more likely is the description saying the two men embraced, and then Heraclius crowned him with his own crown, suggesting they were equals. Heraclius also offered his daughter, Augusta Eudocia, to the Turkish Khagan for a marriage in 2 years' time, a prospect we can be pretty sure the poor girl was not too thrilled about. But Heraclius was keen to emphasise to Khosroes that the special relationship between Rome and Persia, as the twin superpowers of antiquity, was over. Henceforth, Rome's special relationship was with the Turks. Although this display of Romano-Turkish solidarity must have intimidated the Persian garrison at Tiflis, they did their best not to show it. The city had gigantic walls and the garrison had been recently reinforced with 1,000 of Khosroes' best troops. The Turkish and Roman assaults against it foundered with heavy casualties. The Romans resorted to using their time-honoured skills at siegecraft, from sapping under the walls to building siege towers as tall as the walls themselves, and even in one place diverting the river so that its flow would undermine the walls. But all to no avail. The walls stood firm and the defenders didn't give up hope. Frustrated, the Romans and Turks devastated the surrounding countryside. The siege dragged on into August, and the hot summer was not to the Turks' liking. The Persians' confidence grew, and they started entertaining their besiegers with crude puppet shows of Heraclius and the Yabgu Khan. This seems to have been the last straw for the Turks. In September or October, they called it quits and headed back north. They kept their alliance with the Romans, but the expedition had been deeply disappointing. However, for Heraclius, the campaign was far from over. He needed to make the most of his few resources and bring the war to a conclusion. His aim was to unnerve the Persian aristocracy, fuel discontent with Khosroes' rule, and precipitate a rebellion against him. To do this, attack was yet again the best form of defence. He abandoned Tiflis and headed straight south into Persian-held Mesopotamia. His veteran soldiers crossed the Zagros Mountains and headed south into northern Iran near Lake Urmia, the area where he'd surprised and defeated Khosroes in 624. Again, the boldness of his strategy took the Persian Shah by surprise. The new Persian army under Razad was in Armenia waiting for Tiflis to fall and the Romano-Turkish assault to be unleashed. When Tiflis held out and the Turks withdrew, Razad assumed Heraclius had crossed the Zagros Mountains to head home west, especially since it was now November and winter was drawing in. Therefore, he was astonished to learn Heraclius was advancing deep into Persian territory, destroying everything in his path. Heraclius's tactics were the same as in his previous campaigns: to strike into enemy territory, burn and pillage, force the Persian armies to pursue him, play cat and mouse with them, and lure them into an ambush or a trap. Khosroes was no doubt wise to Heraclius's game, but he had no option other than to tell his new general Razad to hunt him down and destroy his army. He was acutely aware that Heraclius's bold antics were imperiling his reputation and edging his subjects closer to rebellion, just as Heraclius intended. Heraclius zigzagged across northern Iran with Razad in hot pursuit. He often waited for Persian reconnaissance units to move forward to probe the Roman positions before mercilessly destroying them. Despite Persian losses, Khosroes sent every available soldier to join Razad, so desperate was he to score a victory over his great adversary. With the weather turning worse as they headed into December, Heraclius headed west into northern Mesopotamia, near the Persian city of Nineveh, hoping to make it look as if he was, this time, retreating into Roman territory. As ever, Razad took the bait and pursued him, urged on by the anxious Khosroes. Heraclius chose his trap well. Near to Nineveh, he found a small flat plain near to modern Dohuk. There he set up an ambush as the Persians thundered through it. A thick covering of mist on the 12th of December helped him, since the Persians couldn't see the Romans until it was too late. Attacked on all sides, Razad and most of his high command were killed. The Persian rank and file suffered heavy casualties, but held ranks and didn't break up, knowing they'd be slaughtered if they fled in disorder. Heraclius called off the Roman attack, allowing the remnants of the Persian army to withdraw and keeping his own losses small. It was the culmination of his series of victories over the Persians. Known as the Battle of Nineveh, some 800 years later, the Italian Renaissance artist Piero della Francesca immortalized it in his beautiful frescoes in Arezzo in Italy. After the battle, yet again Heraclius wrong-footed the Persians. The battered remnants of Rezad's army regrouped west of Nineveh and were reinforced by Khosroes' guards regiments from Ctesiphon. They hoped to catch Heraclius as he finally turned west for home, but yet again their man gave them the slip. Opting once more for attack rather than defence, Heraclius led his fast-moving army straight for the Persian capital, Ctesiphon. In commando-like raids, units of the Roman army seized the vital bridges that allowed him to cross and recross the winding route of the Zab River as he worked his way south. His immediate aim was Khosroes' palace at Dastagerd, north of Ctesiphon. Khosroes was actually in residence there and fled to Ctesiphon with his family. Heraclius wasn't far behind. He dispatched messengers offering peace terms, knowing that Khosroes couldn't accept peace without being humiliated. Equally, continued resistance would only stir up revolt against him. Heraclius employed every trick to incite revolt, for example, sending envoys to Shabaraz, promising to recognize him if he seized the Persian crown. But in the event, it wasn't Shabaraz who overthrew Khosroes, but another general, Gordonaspa. He stage-managed a highly efficient coup. First, he gathered around him a reliable group of supporters in Ctesiphon itself, comprising most of the senior army high command, including two of Shabaraz's sons who were senior officers. They agreed to put Khosroes' son, Kavad Shiro, on the throne. Although he was already first in line to inherit it, he'd fallen out with his father and had fled the capital, fearing his father would choose his half-brother Murdazan to succeed him. Gordonaspa then took the extraordinary step of inviting the Romans in on the plot. He sent a deputation to Heraclius' camp, which was some 200 miles north of Ctesiphon, to offer peace if they overthrew Khosroes. Heraclius accepted. He was actually located in the foothills of the Zagros Mountains to the northeast of Ctesiphon, where heavy snowfall made movement difficult. Indeed, the Persian deputation didn't reach him until probably early February. Gordonaspa, with his thorough planning, set a date of the 23rd and 24th of February for the coup. The Persian deputies returned, with Heraclius' approval, to Ctesiphon. It seems as if almost everyone was in on the planned coup, except for Khosroes himself. It went like clockwork. Khosroes was arrested on the night of the 24th of February. He tried to escape, but was easily restrained. Kavad Shiro travelled to Ctesiphon and was crowned king the next day. On the 28th of February, a grisly fate befell Khosroes and most of his family. Reminiscent of Phocas's brutal murder of Maurice and his family, Khosroes was made to watch as most of the male members of his family were beheaded one after another in front of his eyes. His favourite son, Murdazan, was first for the chop. Finally, Khosroes himself, the man who'd extended the Sasanian domain further west than any Persian king except Xerxes, and who'd threatened the very existence of the Roman Empire, was beheaded. Meanwhile, Heraclius was snowed in the Zagros Mountains. In an almost comic ending to what had been such a fast-moving war, Heraclius had to wait weeks for news of Khosroes' execution. It seems two messengers finally made it through the snow on the 24th of March. We can imagine the wild celebrations that must have ensued as the soldiers danced in the snow, and our sources say in a rather more sombre tone, they gave thanks to God. The war had lasted for 26 years. Most of the civic and military infrastructure of both the Roman Empire and Persia had been destroyed. Many historians regard the war as marking the end of the ancient world. But this didn't detract from Heraclius's great achievement. He'd snatched victory from the jaws of defeat, and in so doing, he changed the entire course of history. But while victory came quickly at the end of this long war, a workable peace settlement was slower to materialize. The reason was dissension among the Persians. For while Khosroes' son Kavid Shiro, or Kavid II as historians call him, had been elevated to the throne with surprising ease through the efforts of Gordonaspa, he wasn't accepted by Shahrbaraz, Heraclius' old enemy and commander of most of the Persian army that had survived the war. Shahrbaraz rebelled against him. His cause was strengthened by the fact Kavad II was so pliable in accepting Roman victory that he promised to restore the pre-war boundaries, i.e. to give up the Levant and Egypt to Heraclius. But Shahrbaraz, who still controlled this area, refused to concede defeat. This didn't stop Heraclius returning to Constantinople to celebrate his victory in June 628. But while the Romans were celebrating, Shahrbaraz refused to budge from the conquered territories. His position was strengthened when a recurrence of bubonic plague killed Kavad II. He died in late summer 628 and was succeeded by his 7-year-old son Ardashir III under the guardianship of Mar-Adur Gushnasp, an aristocrat who became the regent and de facto ruler of the empire. Suddenly, Heraclius's peace settlement with Persia was looking very fragile. If Shahrbaraz seized the throne, the Levant and Egypt would remain with Persia. But Heraclius got lucky. He was saved by his allies, the Turks. In 628, the Yabgu Khagan attacked again through the Caucasus. He didn't care Heraclius had made peace with Persia. He wanted to make up for his disappointing expedition in 627. A powerful Turkish army advanced against Tiflis, which had so valiantly defied both Turks and Romans the previous year. But this time it was different. The Persian garrison was weakened by the withdrawal of some of its units to counter the threat Shahrbaraz posed. After a couple of months, the city fell to a massive Turkish assault. The Turks spared no one. Most of its inhabitants were butchered. The Khagan took particular delight in taking retribution for the humiliating puppet shows the defenders had staged the previous year when they mocked both him and Heraclius. The Persian commander and an Iberian prince said to be responsible were blinded, tortured, strangled, flayed, and stuffed before their bodies were hung in display from the walls. After that, no one was going to put on another puppet show in a hurry. But worse was to follow. The Turks occupied the whole of Albania, as the Caucasus region north of Iran was called, and which corresponds to modern Azerbaijan. This was a vitally important area for the Persians, since it protected the heartland of Iran from Turkish attack. Conveniently for Heraclius, Persian attention was diverted from retaining Roman territory to defending its heartland against the Turks. Shahrbaraz's army was the only one capable of doing this. His political capital was thereby greatly increased. Ardashir's days looked numbered. Heraclius, ever the astute politician, was quick to foment a Persian civil war. He offered to back Shahrbaraz's ambition to oust Ardashir if he would return Egypt and the Levant. In the spring of 629, Shahrbaraz agreed, and even promised to return the True Cross as well. Heraclius allowed him to keep Amida and Edessa, two important Roman strongholds, to give him the political kudos he needed to make a claim on the throne. Shahrbaraz advanced on Ctesiphon, took the city without much resistance, executed Mer-Adur Gushnasp and his supporters but allowed Ardashir to remain Shah. He sent a powerful force of cavalry, mainly Arabs, to confront the Turks, although this was ambushed and annihilated. Heraclius celebrated the return of the True Cross and the evacuation of Persian forces from the Levant and Egypt in a grand ceremony held in Jerusalem on the 21st of March 630. The poet George of Pisidia recorded it, saying, "The Emperor Constantine himself should return from the heavens and pay respect to Heraclius." But he wasn't yet at the pinnacle of his fortunes. For that year, Persia was further weakened when Shahrbaraz took the unwise step of executing the boy king, Ardashir, and seizing the throne for himself. Killing a legitimate Sasanian king was deeply unpopular, and Shahrbaraz was assassinated in June 630. He was succeeded by Boran, Khosroes' daughter, who was the closest dynastically to Khosroes, since Kavad had killed all his brothers, and there was simply no male Sasanian heirs left alive. Female rulers were rare in the macho Persian society, and her government was fearful of a counter-coup and keen to win Heraclius' approval. She agreed to restore the Roman frontier to what it had been in 591, when Maurice had triumphed and extended Roman dominion over most of Armenia and further east than any Roman emperor had ever achieved. Heraclius' luck didn't end there. The Turks were now emerging as the new superpower in the region and a potential danger to Rome. But fortune favours the bold, and Heraclius was helped by the unexpected collapse of Turkish power in 629 and 630, caused by developments in China. When a new dynasty in China, the Tang, launched a powerful offensive against the eastern part of the Turkish Confederation, they defeated the Turks and captured two of the eastern Khagans. In a domino-style collapse, this led to the downfall of the Western Turkish Confederation. The Yabgu Khagan withdrew his forces from Albania and disappeared from history. By the end of 630, Heraclius was left as the dominant ruler in the whole of Western Eurasia. But just as he reached the very apex of power, the foundations of his success started to crumble. For in the same year, 630, when Heraclius celebrated his victory over Persia, a man called Muhammad celebrated his conquest of Mecca. In that year, the eyes of the world were fixed on Heraclius, but in only a few more years they would be fixed on something far more momentous: the rise of Islam. And that ends this episode. Thanks so much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. We've now reached one of the most exciting parts of the story of Rome's decline and fall, in my view, the rise of Islam. And we'll start to look at this in 2 weeks' time on the 1st of February. And in the meantime, if you're looking for something to read, I strongly recommend my new book on Justinian's turbulent reign called Justinian's Empire, link in the show notes. And as ever, a shout out to German listeners that the first book in my series called The Roman Revolution is now published in German, Die Römische Revolution, and you can find it on Amazon DE. Again, link in the show notes. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.